With Bernie Sanders overtaking Biden in new national polling and doing well in matchups against Donald Trump in very key states, the Democratic establishment is now in a panic that a self described Democratic socialist could become the next president. Even though, of course, technically we already had a Democratic socialist president that kept getting reelected in a landslide, so much so that they ended up having to put term limits in. Yeah, I guess they couldn't handle all the actual winning. No, the same kind of people who didn't like the changes by FDR and even LBJ, which brought us both Medicare and Social Security, are now nervous about Bernie Sanders. Now, federal government lobbyists, these are my favorite people to hear from, the lobbyists, told The Hill on Friday that they're increasingly concerned that a Bernie Sanders presidency could be, quote, uncharted waters for their clients, given the Vermont senator's history of antipathy towards big business and the role of corporate power in U.S. politics. Lobbyist Kevin O'Neill, a partner with the D.C. firm Arnold and Porter, said, quote, in our lifetime, we have not had a presidential candidate so openly hostile towards corporations. Now, understand this. Bernie Sanders is not hostile to business itself. What he is hostile to is cronyism. He is hostile to, along with the rest of the American people, and you can check the polls on this one, the idea that corporations should be able to buy our politicians and subvert democracy. But when your entire business model runs on those things and on low taxes, while you're paying your employees the starvation wage and getting fat handouts from the federal government, contracts, etc., I guess a Bernie Sanders presidency would seem pretty hostile to you, wouldn't it? Because if you're a big billion-dollar business, and I'm talking about big corporations, I'm talking about Amazon, right? Cannot run without screwing their employees over and making them depend on government services and benefits, for example, Walmart, while your executives buy yachts and get gigantic executive bonuses, then maybe you shouldn't be in business. I'm just saying. That's the whole crux of his message. Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, Schreck lobbyist Al Matur told The Hill, Washington is rigged, and it's rigged in part from the wealthy and the powerful. You would expect businesses to have concerns with him. Yeah, that's because he's right. I mean, when you nail it, when you tell people the truth, well, and the truth's not so flattering to some of these corporations, yeah, they're not going to be happy about it. I mean, how can anybody look at Washington and the way that it operates and say, oh, no, it's fine, right? The fact that you have corporations giving massive donations to political candidates who then write and pass legislation that helps those corporations and large donors. I mean, is that not going to look corrupt? No, it looks totally corrupt. And the American people agree. And again, it is that corruption that people notice in their everyday lives. And so several years ago, I think it was 2014, there was a study by Princeton University. And I used to bring this up all the time. And it's still relevant today because it points out what the United States actually is, an oligarchy. And I know, but Dr. Jason Johnson right now is screaming, going, it's not an oligarchy. Stop being dangerous. That has implications of Russian billionaires and oil companies. No. An oligarchy is basically where a small group of people who are very wealthy based on their wealth make all the decisions. And we do have that under a veneer of representative democracy or a representative republic. So now these researchers concluded that government policies rarely align with the preferences of the majority of Americans. So let me give you an example. If over 60% of Americans favor a wealth tax on the very, very rich, right, in order to fund things like education, healthcare, etc., well, they rarely get it. In fact, they never get it. Now, if special interests, however, and lobbying firms and organizations want to deregulate things like the banks, well, golly gee, that just seems to happen. In fact, that's happened back in 2018 when they started stripping Dodd-Frank and deregulating it. And so now we have deregulation of the banks again, setting us up for another recession, possible global recession, thanks to things like I don't know derivatives and being able to sell terrible like financial vehicles where they package bad debt up and sell it and speculate on it, things like that. The stuff that really brought down our economy back in 2008. Well, they get that because guess what? They have paid off the lobbyists have paid off the lawmakers. And so both, and by the way, it ends up being passed on a bipartisan basis. So understand that it's not just Republicans, it's not just Democrats, it's a whole system that's corrupt. But I know Chris Matthews is also now yelling at me and saying, don't call it corrupt. How dare you call our system corrupt? But it is. Now, the study further found that when a majority of citizens disagree with economic elites and or with organized interests, they generally lose. That's not a surprise. I just pointed out an example as well. For example, we've got background checks for gun purchases. National background checks is something that over 90% of Americans agree with, but we've got massive lobbying from the NRA. Now, the NRA is not a powerful organization, but it is powerful on Capitol Hill because of how much money it uses or spends to buy our politicians so that they never do anything about gun legislation. That's a great example. The elites don't want that because guess what? They make money. And so, moreover, it says, because of the strong status quo bias built into the U.S. political system, even when fairly large majorities of Americans favor policy change, they generally do not get it. Or another way to say it is, of course, the American people, regular people, pretty much have no power to affect actual policy. Whereas the lobbyists and the elites, they have all the power and they basically use it to serve themselves and their own financial or class interests. Now, again, sometimes that does help us because there are times where the will of the elites and the American people do overlap. That happens about 10% of the time. So 10% of the time, if we see something get passed that is generally good, it's because the elites deigned to say, okay, we're fine with that. That's not going to hurt our bottom line. Or we need a PR boost. We need to do something positive. So, we're going to let this one go. And we're going to not lobby against it. But that leaves the other 90% of the time where the lobbyists, whatever they want, and the corporations and the moneyed elite, well, they end up getting exactly what they want against the wishes of regular working people. And so that is an oligarchy. And yes, we do live in one of those. Now, as far as Bernie Sanders, I can see how someone like Bernie makes these people feel very, very threatened. He, after all, wants to take away their power and give it back to these regular working people. In fact, according to The Hill, Sanders has vowed to shake up how the influence world does business with proposals to ban donations from federal lobbyists and corporations and to prohibit the corporate funding of party conventions. That's another reason why the DNC wants to shut him down and make sure that he is not the Democratic nominee using a contested or brokered convention. Unsurprisingly, the lobbyists did not like those ideas, but now they're admitting, yeah, we're kind of scared because Bernie Sanders is doing really, really well, and we're trying to shut this whole thing down. In a memo, declines on Sanders' rise in the polls, lobbying for a monument advocacy, warned that the senator's fundraising model, which relies, of course, on small donors, there are no super PACs. No, our revolution is not a super PAC, and they have given no money or spent no money on behalf of Bernie Sanders. So, sorry, Warren stands, that's not going to work. Whereas Elizabeth Warren is actually getting money from super PACs. They have already spent over $5 million on ads in Super Tuesday states. on behalf of Elizabeth Warren. But you've got that fundraising model that is incredibly successful. The average donation, I think, is still around $18 to Senator Bernie Sanders' campaign. You also have the million-strong volunteer army, and of course, national surrogates that are pretty popular, like, for example, Nina Turner. They say that they're a potent weapon against, quote, corporate interests. And that, in fact, they said, Senator Sanders is breaking the mold in presidential politics with every gain he makes in the primary process. And like another unconventional candidate who today sits in the Oval Office, you can throw out the typical playbook for what American businesses should expect over the coming months or more. You know, it's interesting, though. Generally, business under Trump has been pretty good for corporations. They got their giant tax cuts. They got a lot of deregulation. And look, farming, which agriculture was a disaster thanks to the tariffs with China. And then, of course, you have the massive stock drops that have happened just recently. And so I guess maybe business not doing so well. But for a while, boy, they were. They sure were. And so all this fear-mongering, of course, is coming from these very same companies that have gotten pretty much everything they wanted for quite some time. But now they see maybe the writing's on the wall. Now, here's the funny thing, right? Corporations and the country itself, by the way, did best when you had high marginal taxes on the rich. Like, for example, under Eisenhower, right? The American economy actually built and sustained the middle class. Now you no longer have that. According to a conservative study that just came out recently, the typical 40-hour-a-week working male, right, can no longer support a family on his income alone. You used to be able to do that when there's a strong middle class. And of course, the typical working male has to work 53 weeks out of a year in order to afford the basics. There are only 52 weeks in the year. Women, of course, have it worse. They have to work 66 hours a week, 66 weeks out of a year to be able to afford those. And again, there's only 52 weeks in the year. So they're even more underwater. Families are underwater. There are no one-person income, families in the middle class anymore. It has shrunk. If we actually go back to where you had high marginal tax rates in the rich, and investment in public works, and investment back into the people, well, then we would actually return to a point of where we actually had a strong middle class. But unfortunately, there seems to be a lot of corporate influence and lobbyists that do not want to go back to that system. Hey guys, hopefully you enjoyed that free video. Now I'm going to have to ask you a favor. Between the demonetization and the YouTube algorithm messing around with view counts, etc., we're having a hard time adjusting to the new YouTube reality, which is where you guys come in. See, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/TYTNation, set up to help us rely on you guys, the viewers, instead of big corporate ads. Look, you know the show. You know I'm not in favor of big corporations anyway. So help us transition away from relying on the ad model to pay the bills and sign up to be a patron, patreon.com/TYTNation. That goes a long way to help us keep the lights on. And you guys will know that you're supporting independent, progressive media.